A poor girl who gave her last blanket to a homeless man was shocked to discover he was a secret billionaire CEO. "You are a disgrace to this family, and you are no longer welcome here." The rain hammered down on the grimy pavement like 1,000 desperate fists, relentless and wild, each drop a tiny, cold rejection. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the stark alley for a split second before darkness swallowed it whole, leaving Alara to clutch the thin, threadbare lapels of her worn coat tighter against the biting cold that had nothing to do with the weather. Her mother's words echoed in the sterile silence between thunderclaps, each syllable a polished stone thrown at her already shattered spirit. She had been cast out, disowned, and utterly abandoned, all for the crime of being a reminder of their humble past now that her younger sister, Chloe, had married into staggering wealth. She was an embarrassment, a relic, a ghost at their gleaming new feast. Her heart thudded a slow, painful rhythm inside her chest, a hollow drum in a cavernous, empty space. She was alone. The city lights shimmered through the sheets of rain, bleeding into blurry constellations of amber and gold, mocking her with their warmth and vibrance. Alara walked without direction, her soaked shoes making soft, squelching sounds on the concrete, the only sound that belonged to her in a world that had suddenly become alien and hostile. Her entire life had been dedicated to them, working 2 jobs to help her mother pay the bills, forgoing her own dreams so Chloe could have the best dresses and the best tutors, offering her own meager savings for the down payment on the car that had first caught the eye of her sister's now powerful husband. She had been the steady foundation upon which they had built their new, ornate life, and now that it was complete, the foundation had been unceremoniously discarded. A trembling sigh escaped her lips, visible as a white puff in the frigid air, a fragile testament to her existence. The world felt brittle, as if it could splinter into a million pieces at any moment. Total silence settled in her soul. She found herself near a small, quiet park, the skeletal branches of the trees dripping with a sorrow that matched her own. On a dark, wooden bench, partially shielded by a weeping willow whose branches wept in earnest tonight, sat a figure. He was a man, huddled into himself, wearing clothes that looked as weary and soaked as her own. His head was bowed, his shoulders slumped in a posture of such profound defeat that it called out to the gaping wound in her own chest. He looked gaunt, haunted, his face pale under the flickering light of a distant street lamp. He didn't seem to notice the pounding rain or the wind that whipped around him. He seemed to exist in a storm far more violent than the one raging outside. For a moment, Alara felt the sharp, selfish instinct to keep walking, to hoard the last vestiges of her own body heat, to protect the fragile shell she had erected around her pain. But then she saw him shiver, a violent, uncontrollable tremor that shook his entire frame. Her heart clenched. That single, involuntary movement shattered her self-pity. Here was a soul in even more desperate need than her own. Inside her worn bag was her one remaining comfort, a thick, woolen blanket her father had given her years ago, before sickness had stolen him from the world. It was old and the edges were frayed, but it held the scent of home, of safety, of a love that had been unconditional. It was all she had left of him, besides the small silver locket around her neck. Her hand hesitated for only a second, a silent debate between memory and compassion. Then, with a quiet resolve that felt more natural to her than breathing, she pulled the blanket from her bag. The fabric was warm and dry against her cold fingers. She approached the bench, her steps soft and uncertain. "Excuse me," she said, her voice barely a whisper above the storm. The man looked up, and for the first time she saw his eyes. They were the color of a stormy sea, hollowed out by a grief so immense it seemed to suck the very air from around them. He looked at her, not with suspicion, but with a vacant, shattered gaze. "You're freezing," she stated simply, her voice gentle. "Please, take this." Before he could protest or even fully register her presence, she unfolded the thick blanket and draped it carefully over his trembling shoulders, tucking it around him with an instinctual, motherly care she hadn't known she possessed. She pulled her own threadbare coat tighter, the biting cold a sharp reminder of her sacrifice. He froze. The man, Adrian Vance, sat perfectly still beneath the sudden, unexpected warmth of the blanket, the scent of lavender and old books rising from the worn wool. The world, which for 5 years had been a muted landscape of gray, transactional emptiness, suddenly exploded into raw, undeniable color. A warmth that had nothing to do with temperature spread through his chest, a seismic shift in the frozen tundra of his soul. He had sat on this bench in the rain for hours, deliberately seeking the physical misery to distract from the unbearable internal agony that was the anniversary of the day he had lost his wife and daughter. He, a man who could buy the entire city block without a second thought, had dressed in old clothes and sought out the storm, hoping to feel something, anything, other than the echoing silence of his cavernous mansion. And he had felt nothing, until now. This stranger, this girl with haunted, sincere eyes and a face pale with her own suffering, had just given him her only shield against the storm. He watched her, stunned, as she offered him a small, trembling smile, her sincerity so pure it was like a physical blow. "Stay warm," she whispered, her voice cracking slightly. Then, without another word, she turned and vanished back into the relentless, pounding rain, a fleeting angel in a threadbare coat. Adrian clutched the blanket, the soft fabric a sacred relic in his hands. It was the first unsolicited act of kindness he had received in years, an act performed by someone who clearly had nothing, for someone she believed had even less. It was a gesture so selfless, so completely devoid of agenda, that it struck him as miraculous. His cynical, carefully constructed world, where everything had a price and every favor was a debt, splintered into 1,000 pieces. A single, hot tear, the first in half a decade, traced a path down his cold cheek, mingling with the rain. Who was she? He had to know. This profound connection, this momentary flash of light in his endless night, was something he would not let go of. He didn't know it yet, but this moment would change everything. A sob caught in his throat. He immediately pulled out his sleek, waterproof phone, its glowing screen a stark contrast to his destitute appearance, and made a single call. "Find her," he commanded, his voice raw with an emotion his security chief hadn't heard in years. A young woman, early 20s, pale, with the kindest eyes you've ever seen. She was just here, at the corner of Elm and 7th. She gave me a blanket. Use every resource. I want to know everything about her. The gears of a vast, powerful machine began to turn, set in motion by a single, gentle act. While Alara sought shelter in a grim, hourly motel, paying with the last crumpled bills from her pocket, Adrian Vance was already mobilizing a private army to find the one person who had managed to rekindle the pilot light of his soul. He wrapped the blanket tighter around himself, not for warmth, but to hold onto the feeling she had given him. It was hope. The next few weeks for Alara were a blur of quiet, dignified desperation. She found a tiny, damp room in a rundown boarding house, its single window overlooking a brick wall. The cold was a constant companion, seeping through the thin walls and the cracks in the window frame. She spent her days searching for work, her worn-out shoes treading miles of unforgiving pavement, facing rejection after rejection. Yet she never faltered. Her resolve was steady. Her spirit, though bruised, remained unbroken. She ate little, usually just a piece of bread or a small bowl of thin soup, saving what little money she earned from odd cleaning jobs for the rent. The world was a heavy fog of uncertainty, but within it, she carried the memory of her father's strength and the strange, unspoken connection she'd felt with the man on the bench. She often wondered if he had stayed warm that night, a tender thought for a stranger that momentarily eased her own gnawing hunger. She was unaware that a guardian angel was already watching over her, his presence felt but unseen. One morning, a crisp envelope appeared under her door. Inside was a money order for 3 months' rent with a simple, typed note attached. It read, "Kindness should be rewarded." Alara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She stared at the note, her heart pounding a wild, frantic rhythm. She had no idea where it could have come from. It felt like a miracle, a reprieve from the relentless pressure that had been tightening around her chest. A few days later, another surprise. A large box was delivered to the boarding house, addressed to her. Inside was a treasure trove of food. Fresh fruit, vegetables, warm bread, cheese, and several containers of hearty, homemade soup. There was no note this time, just the quiet, undeniable evidence that someone, somewhere, cared. These anonymous acts of kindness were a lifeline, a golden glow in her bleak existence. They were a mystery she couldn't solve, but they gave her the strength to keep going. She didn't know that each delivery was personally overseen by Adrian, who watched from a sleek, black car parked discreetly down the street, his chest aching with a protective tenderness he hadn't felt in years. He was orchestrating her survival from the shadows, ensuring she had a safe place to land while he figured out how to re-enter her life without frightening her. He was her hidden savior. Adrian learned everything about her. He learned of her family's cruel betrayal, of her selfless sacrifices, of her unwavering dignity in the face of unbearable hardship. Each new piece of information solidified the awe he had felt on that rainy night. In a world of grasping, selfish people like her mother and sister, Elara was an anomaly. She was pure. She deserved not just survival, but a life of joy and security. He knew he couldn't remain a shadow forever. He had to meet her again, to see her, to hear her voice. He arranged for a chance encounter, a carefully staged accident at a small, quiet bookshop she visited every Tuesday, a place she went not to buy, but to simply be in the soft hush among the stories. He dressed in an impeccably tailored but understated suit, a stark contrast to his previous disguise, but he kept his demeanor quiet and approachable. He watched her gently trace the spine of a worn poetry book, her expression soft and wistful. Taking a deep breath, he turned the corner of an aisle and gently bumped into her, sending a small stack of books tumbling to the floor. "Oh, I am so terribly sorry," he said, his voice a low, steady baritone. She looked up, and her eyes, the same sincere eyes from that night, widened slightly in recognition, though she couldn't quite place him. Her heart fluttered. "It's no trouble at all," she replied, her voice as gentle as he remembered. As they both knelt to pick up the books, their hands brushed, sending a jolt of warmth through them both. He looked at her, his gaze unwavering, and said, "I feel as though we've met before." Elara searched his face, the handsome, commanding features so different from the haunted, gaunt man on the bench, yet the eyes were the same. A storm of grief and a profound sadness resided in their depths. I don't think so," she faltered, a blush creeping up her pale cheeks. He smiled, a small, sad smile that reached his eyes for the first time in ages. "Perhaps not. My name is Adrian," he offered his hand. "Elara," she replied, placing her small, calloused hand in his large, warm one. The connection was immediate, an unspoken understanding that passed between them. He didn't know how he would bridge the gap between this man and the one she had saved, but he knew with absolute certainty that he would not let her go again. This was the beginning. Their conversation started there, in the quiet aisles of the bookshop, and soon moved to a nearby cafe where Adrian would insist on buying her a hot cup of tea, a subtle nod to their first meeting that only he understood. He was a patient, gentle presence in her life, a steady rock in the turbulent sea of her existence. He never spoke of wealth or power. He presented himself as just a man, one who was a good listener and had kind, sad eyes. Elara found herself opening up to him in a way she never had with anyone else. She told him about her dreams of being a gardener, of creating beautiful, peaceful spaces for people, a dream she had long since buried under the weight of her family's demands. He listened with an intensity that made her feel seen, truly seen, for the first time. He never offered pity, only a quiet, unwavering respect that was more comforting than any platitude. Her trust in him grew with each passing day. The bond between them felt ancient and undeniable. One evening, after a particularly difficult day where she was rudely turned away from a potential job, he found her sitting on the steps of her boarding house, her shoulders slumped in defeat. He didn't say a word. He simply sat down beside her in the encroaching twilight, his presence a silent comfort. The silence deepened. "Sometimes I feel like I'm invisible," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. Adrian turned to her, his expression raw and tender. "You are the least invisible person I have ever met," he said, his voice low and firm. He then asked if he could take her for a simple dinner, a proper meal. She was hesitant, not wanting to be a charity case, but his sincere insistence wore down her defenses. He didn't take her to an ornate, fancy restaurant. Instead, he brought a bag filled with ingredients to her small, clean room, ingredients he knew she loved from his secret observations. He insisted on cooking for her, moving around the tiny kitchenette with an easy, surprising grace. The act was so disarmingly normal, so profoundly kind, that it chipped away the last of her walls. It was in this safe, warm space, over a simple meal of pasta and fresh bread, that the confessions began. The flickering light from a single candle cast their faces in an amber hue, creating an island of intimacy in the quiet room. Elara, feeling a sense of safety she hadn't known was possible, began to speak. She told him the whole story of her family, not with anger or bitterness, but with a deep, weary sadness. She spoke of the constant sacrifices, the emotional neglect, and the final, brutal act of abandonment at her sister Chloe's engagement party, where her mother had publicly called her a worthless burden. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, glistening in the candlelight. Adrian watched her, his gaze steady and unflinching. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer empty words of comfort. When she finished, a heavy silence filled the room, thick with her unspoken pain. He simply reached across the small table and placed his hand gently over hers. His touch was warm and firm. It was an anchor. Then he began to speak, his voice soft and laced with a pain that mirrored her own. "I understand what it feels like to lose your family," he started. He told her about his wife, Eleanor, and his daughter, Lily. He spoke of their laughter, of the light they brought into his life, and of the drunk driver who had stolen them from him on a rainy night 5 years ago. He told her how his world had shattered, how his heart had turned to stone, and how he had been sleepwalking through life ever since. He confessed that for years, he had felt nothing but a hollow, echoing grief. His vulnerability was a gift, a sacred offering of his shattered heart. Elara listened, her own sorrow momentarily forgotten, replaced by a wave of profound empathy for this kind, broken man. Her heart ached for him. They were two fractured souls finding solace in each other's broken pieces. In that small, dimly lit room, they forged a bond over their shared grief, a connection that ran deeper than romance, deeper than friendship. It was a kinship of survivors. When he finished his story, the air was thick with their shared tragedies, but it wasn't heavy. It was cathartic. Elara gently squeezed his hand, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears for his loss. "I'm so sorry, Adrian," she whispered, the words feeling terribly inadequate. He simply nodded, his own eyes glistening. The unspoken understanding between them was more powerful than any words could be. The moment felt tender and sacred. He knew then that his feelings for her were not just about gratitude or protection. It was something far deeper. He was falling in love with her pure, resilient spirit. As he prepared to leave, he paused at the door. "Elara," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You have a strength in you that could move mountains." It was the highest compliment she had ever received, and it settled in her heart like a warm, glowing ember. She was not alone anymore. The universe, however, had one more trial for her, one final act of cruelty to endure before her salvation. It came in the form of an invitation, or rather, a summons. Her sister Chloe was hosting a major charity gala, a glittering affair for the city's elite, and the catering company Elara had finally secured a part-time job with was working the event. It was a cruel twist of fate. The thought of seeing her family, of being a servant in their new, gleaming world, filled her with a biting cold dread, but she couldn't afford to refuse the work. She needed the money desperately. So, with a deep breath and a quiet prayer for strength, she pinned on her crisp, black uniform, tied her hair back severely, and prepared to become invisible once more. She did not know that Adrian Vance was the guest of honor and the primary benefactor of the entire event. He was scheduled to give the keynote address. The stage was set for a collision of worlds. The ballroom was a cavernous space of polished marble and glittering chandeliers, filled with the murmur of polite conversation and the clinking of champagne glasses. Alara moved through the crowd like a ghost, her tray of appetizers held steady, her face a mask of professional neutrality. She kept her eyes down, avoiding the sea of ornate gowns and impeccable tuxedos. But then she heard a voice that made her blood run cold. Well, well, look what the cat dragged in. Alara froze. She looked up to see her mother, Margaret, and her sister, Chloe, standing before her, their faces masks of cruel, smug amusement. They were dressed in shimmering designer gowns, dripping with jewels, looking at Alara's simple uniform with utter contempt. I should have known you'd find a way to slither into a place like this, Chloe hissed, her voice low and venomous. Let me guess, trying to steal the silver? Alara's face went pale, but she held her head high, her dignity her only shield. I'm working, Chloe, she said, her voice quiet but firm. Please, just leave me alone. Her mother laughed. A sharp, ugly sound. Working? You call this working? You're an embarrassment. We finally cleanse our lives of your poverty. And you show up here to shame us in front of all our new, important friends. A small crowd was beginning to gather, drawn by the scent of drama. Alara's heart pounded against her ribs. She felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, judging, dissecting. The humiliation was a physical thing, a tightening in her chest that made it hard to breathe. The cruelty escalated. Chloe, wanting to create a bigger scene, suddenly gasped dramatically. My bracelet! My diamond bracelet is gone! She shrieked, clutching her bare wrist. It was here just a moment ago. You! She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at Alara. You bumped into me. You stole it. You pathetic little thief. The accusation hung in the sterile silence of the suddenly quieted ballroom. Alara's world splintered. No! She whispered, her voice trembling. I would never. Margaret stepped forward, her face a mask of righteous fury. Of course you would. You've always been jealous. Security, she bellowed. Arrest this girl. She's a thief. 2 large security guards began to advance on Alara, who stood rooted to the spot, trapped in a nightmare. She was utterly alone, her quiet dignity no match for their loud, vicious lies. She closed her eyes, bracing for the final, crushing blow of public shame. And then, a new voice cut through the tension, calm, commanding, and dangerously cold. That's enough. The crowd parted like the Red Sea. Adrian Vance strode through them, his presence so powerful it seemed to suck all the air out of the room. He was dressed in a crisp, black tuxedo that made him look like a king, his face carved from granite, his stormy eyes fixed on Margaret and Chloe with an expression of pure ice. He came to a stop directly in front of Alara, positioning himself as a human shield between her and her accusers. He didn't even glance at them. Instead, his gaze softened as it fell on Alara's pale, shocked face. Are you all right? He asked, his voice a tender murmur only she could hear. She could only nod, her throat tight with a mix of terror and disbelief. Adrian gave her a small, reassuring smile before turning his attention back to her family. The shift was instantaneous. The warmth vanished, replaced by a commanding chill. I believe you've made a mistake, he said, his voice echoing in the cavernous silence. Chloe scoffed, emboldened by her social standing. And who are you to interfere? This is a family matter. This waitress is a thief. Adrian raised an eyebrow, a flicker of something dangerous in his eyes. First, he began, his voice dropping to a low, lethal pitch. She is not a thief. I would stake my entire reputation on her integrity. A reputation, I assure you, that is worth more than every jewel in this room combined. Second, her name is Alara. And third, he paused, letting the suspense build. I am Adrian Vance. A collective gasp echoed through the ballroom. The name was legendary. He was one of the wealthiest, most powerful, and most reclusive men in the world. Chloe and Margaret's faces went from smug to ashen in a heartbeat. They had just tried to humiliate a waitress in front of the man who could destroy them with a single phone call. Total silence. "And as for your missing bracelet, Chloe," Adrian continued, his voice dripping with disdain as he gestured to a nearby table, "I believe you'll find it right over there, next to your champagne glass, where you took it off not 5 minutes ago." All eyes turned to the table, where the diamond bracelet lay sparkling under the chandelier light. The lie was exposed. The humiliation was now theirs. A thick, suffocating blanket. Adrian wasn't finished. He turned his chilling gaze upon them, delivering the final, devastating blow. "I came here tonight to announce a multimillion-dollar partnership with your husband's company," he said, looking directly at Chloe. "Consider that deal terminated. My corporation does not do business with people of such despicable character. You tried to ruin an innocent woman tonight. Instead, you have only ruined yourselves." He then turned his back on them completely, a gesture of ultimate dismissal. He extended his hand to Alara, his eyes now filled with that unwavering warmth and tenderness. "Alara," he said softly, his voice a lifeline in the wreckage. "May I take you home?" Numb with shock, disbelief, and a dawning cathartic hope, she placed her trembling hand in his. He squeezed it gently, a silent promise of safety and a new beginning. He led her out of the ballroom, away from the wreckage of her past, leaving her tormentors speechless and shattered in his wake. She was saved. He took her not to her small room, but to his own stately, cavernous home, a place of quiet elegance and soft, golden light. The mansion felt less like a display of wealth and more like a sanctuary, a safe harbor after the storm. He led her to a comfortable living room where a fire crackled warmly in an ornate fireplace. He wrapped a soft, cashmere blanket around her shoulders, a stark contrast to the worn, threadbare one she had given him, and handed her a cup of steaming, fragrant tea. He sat opposite her, not speaking, giving her the space and silence she needed to process the seismic events of the evening. Alara finally looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw the pieces click into place. The kind eyes, the gentle concern, the quiet strength. It was him. It had always been him. "The man on the bench," she whispered, her voice filled with awe. "It was you." A sad smile touched Adrian's lips. "It was," he confirmed softly. He then told her everything. How her single act of selfless kindness had shattered his grief-stricken apathy, how he had searched for her, how he had been anonymously helping her, and how he had been patiently waiting for the right moment to tell her the truth. "You saved me that night, Alara," he said, his voice thick with raw, unspoken emotion. "You gave me a reason to feel again. You showed me there was still purity and goodness in the world when I had lost all faith. Everything I have is yours. Every protection, every comfort. You will never have to suffer again." The declaration was not one of charity, but of profound, tender devotion. It was a promise. Tears of relief, of disbelief, of a hope she had never dared to dream of, streamed down her face. He moved to sit beside her, and with a gentle hand he wiped them away. "I think," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "I am falling in love with you." In that moment, surrounded by the warmth of the fire and the safety of his presence, Alara knew she was home. Her heart, for so long a hollow, aching space, was finally full. 1 year later, the sun cast a golden glow over a sprawling, immaculate garden, bursting with roses, lavender, and gently swaying willow trees. Alara stood on the polished marble balcony of their home, not the guest this time, but the mistress of it. She wore a simple but elegant white dress, her hair flowing freely in the soft breeze. She was no longer the pale, haunted girl from the alley. Her face was filled with a serene, quiet joy. She closed her eyes, breathing in the fragrant air of the garden she had designed and nurtured herself. A pair of strong, familiar arms wrapped around her waist from behind, and she leaned back into Adrian's solid chest, a contented sigh escaping her lips. He rested his chin on her shoulder, his love for her a palpable presence. "What are you thinking about?" he murmured into her hair. She smiled. About a rainy night, she said softly. About a worn blanket and a cup of tea. He tightened his embrace, his heart swelling with a love so profound it still took his breath away. That was the night my life began again, he whispered. Together, they had not only healed their own wounds but had dedicated their lives to healing others. The Vancellara Foundation was now the largest charitable organization in the country, funding shelters, creating educational programs, and providing aid to anyone who, like they once were, felt lost and alone. Her family had faded into obscurity, their social standing ruined, a distant memory of a life she no longer recognized. Her revenge was not in their downfall, but in her own spectacular rise, in the happiness and peace she had found, and in the good they now put into the world every single day. He turned her around to face him, his eyes filled with that same unwavering devotion from the night he had saved her. I love you, Alara, he said, his voice sure and steady. I love you, Adrian, she replied, her heart full. He leaned down and captured her lips in a tender, loving kiss, a perfect seal on their shared past and a beautiful promise for their future. They had found their happily ever after. This story is a testament to the profound, seismic power of a single act of kindness. It shows us that even when we feel we have nothing left to give, a gesture of pure, selfless compassion can ripple outwards, changing not only the life of the receiver but the very course of our own destiny. Alara, in her moment of deepest despair, chose empathy over bitterness, and in doing so, she unknowingly saved the man who would, in turn, save her. Her journey from the cold, lonely alley to a life filled with love and purpose reminds us that true wealth is not measured in dollars or status, but in the unwavering strength and purity of the human heart. It is a fable of resilience, redemption, and the undeniable truth that the light of a good soul can never truly be extinguished. If this story touched your heart and reaffirmed your faith in the power of love and kindness, please let us know. We believe these narratives are more than just entertainment. They are a source of hope and inspiration in a world that can often feel cold and transactional. Your response helps us understand what resonates most deeply with you, our cherished audience. Did you feel the biting cold of Alara's despair? Did your heart soar during Adrian's dramatic rescue? We pour our souls into these tales, and knowing they have found a warm place in yours is our greatest reward. For more soul-stirring stories that celebrate the triumph of the human spirit, please like, share, and subscribe to Soulful Love Tales. By joining our community, you help us continue to create these inspiring narratives of hope, healing, and the miraculous ways that love can find us, even in our darkest moments. Every click, every share, helps spread a message of compassion across the world. We'll see you in the next one.